Good Vach, Shavua Tov. How are you, my holy sisters and brothers? That was the Weber chorus singing the Havdalah ceremony for separating Shabbos from the rest of the week. How are you? Yasher Koach to you. May you be strengthened to grow in mitzvahs every day like you're performing right now, starting the very beginning of your week with a little Talmud study. Fantastic. Well done. Let's light up the darkness. Ooh, come on. It's a new candle. There we go. All right, who's going to be with us as we're getting a little learning in right at the top of the week coming out of Shabbos? Stephen Giger is in Dover, New Hampshire. Yehudit in Florence, South Carolina. James in Indianapolis. John, our buddy from Sedona, saying Lila Tov from Red Rocks. Beautiful. Tevi from Orlando. Brinna from Muncie, New York. Renee says, Hineni, here I am. That is such an important word, Hineni. We read it 3 times in the Akedas Yitzhak, which is in the prayer book every day. The binding of Isaac. Abraham says to God, Hineni, here I am. Even when the biggest challenge that a person could possibly face. And in last week's Torah portion, God says it to Jacob. When Jacob fears taking his family down into Egypt, he's heard of the prophecy from his grandfather Abraham. They're going to end up enslaved there. Should we really go? And God calls to Jacob to comfort him, to say, I will be with you. But that conversation begins, Jacob, and Jacob answers, Hineni, here I am. Here I am is really the most important thing that we can all say in life. Hineni, I'm here to do my duty. Hineni, I'm here for my family. Hineni, I'm here for my community. Hineni, I'm here for my country. Hineni, I'm here for my brothers and sisters around the world. And especially, Hineni, I'm here for you, Lord, to fulfill my obligations. Thank you for that very much, Renee. Lindsay is here from Cincinnati, Ohio. Welcome, Lindsay. I know you're often on the YouTube side. Nice to see you on the Facebook side. Emerald sending 3 green hearts. Ryan from Jacksonville, Florida. Harold says Shavua Tov. He and Loretta. Gloria's in Texas. Nancy in North Carolina. Farah with us from Pakistan. It's so great. How many Talmud classes are teaching Americans in California and in Florida and in Minnesota, and Farah in Pakistan? How wonderful that we're all together. And here's Isabel in Mexico City, El Distrito Federal. Bienvenida, Isabel. Let's see. Crystal Dahlberg is saying Shavua Tov and saying Amen and Hineni. Awesome. Anne is with us from Merced. Elliot says rice is nice. We're going to be talking about rice tonight. Melissa from Great Neck. Lola says it's cold but calm in Cleveland. Kathy, good evening from La Mirada, California. Gail in Virginia. Claire in Washington, D.C. Over there on the YouTube side, Sheila with us from Montana. Lynn in North Texas. Welcome, everybody. Tonight's episode of AT Daily, a couple of dedications from Avi Heyman here in Los Angeles, who dedicates tonight's class to Sal and Nina. Thank you so much, Avi. May you and your family be showered with blessings from on high in this world and in the next. Also, Rita Klatchkin. Rita is dedicating tonight's class in memory of her mom, Esther Hoffman. May Esther's memory always be for a blessing, and may the merit of our learning today accrue to her in the next world and get her ever higher in the uppermost circles of learning in the heavenly base midrash, in the heavenly classroom. Right? We just had a teaching today at my outdoor minyan. That in the heavenly base midrash, this is a base midrash, this is a class, right? A classroom where Torah is learned is a base midrash, a house of learning. And there's a base midrash in heaven, right? And in heaven, you learn that, the values of this world are not the values in heaven. And what is rewarded in this world is not what is rewarded for our deeds in this world, is not the way they're rewarded in this world, is not the way they're rewarded in the next world. And in the next world, we get a whole lot of credit. even for all the things that we were not successful in accomplishing, the good that we tried to accomplish that didn't work out, the times that we would have given to charity, but we just didn't have money in our pocket that we could give to charity, etc. If the desire was there, if the effort was there, even if it didn't meet with success, that will be noted in the book of our deeds, which is opened and read and justice distributed in the heavenly court. So that's something to think about. Okay, so we have spent quite a bit of time in our journey so far through Tractate Pesachim, the 4th volume of the Talmud, talking about what is prohibited on Passover. It's leavened bread, chametz, leavened products. And about how we get rid of our chametz and how we dispose of our chametz and what time we dispose of our chametz and in what manner we dispose of our chametz and what we're selling before the leftovers are destroyed, how we sell them and whether we really possess them, etc. Here on our daf, which is Lamed Hey, page 35 in Tractate Pesachim, we're in chapter 2, and we're going to begin our discussion of Mishnah number 6 in chapter 2. And now we're finally going to talk about not what's prohibited on Passover, but what is obligated. What is obligated on Passover. And specifically, what do we have to do? We have to eat matzah. But matzah cannot be made out of just anything, right? These days, matzah is pretty standardized. It's made out of one grain product pretty much around the world, and that is wheat. But it is not necessary. It's not necessary to make matzah out of wheat, as we shall see. And not every grain can be used for matzah, as we shall see. And that's going to touch on some foods that are permitted and some that are not during Passover. So let's begin by reading Mishnah number 6 here in chapter 2 of Tractate Pesachim. These are the types of grain with which a person fulfills his obligation to eat matzah on the first night of Passover. So note, we have an obligation to eat matzah on the first night of Passover. Throughout the holiday, if we want to eat bread, it needs to be matzah. It has to be unleavened bread. But we're not commanded to eat bread every day of Passover. On the first night of Passover, however, and that would be in Israel because the first day of Passover is celebrated as a 2-day holiday outside of Israel, we are commanded to eat matzah when we're outside of Israel in the diaspora on the first 2 nights of Passover. These are the types of grain with which a person fulfills his obligation to eat matzah on the first night of Passover. With wheat, with barley, with spelt, with rye, and with oats. Now, it should be noted that this is a translation here in the Quran, and this is pretty universally accepted of what these words mean. Wheat and barley are totally clear, so that the editors of the Quran Talmud don't need to put the Hebrew word alongside. But for spelt, rye, and oats, the Hebrew words are kuzmin, shifon, and shibolet shual. Now, there is some disagreement. Are those actually spelt, rye, and oats? And even the sages of the Talmudic period, who were commenting on what the sages said in the Mishnaic period, had some disagreement about what grains were being talked about. But for now, we'll go with that translation. And one fulfills his obligation by eating not only matzah made from properly tithed grains, but even with matzah made from doubtfully tithed produce, and matzah made with the first tithe from which its teruma, the set portion for the priest, was already taken, or second tithe and consecrated food that were redeemed. We'll come to that later. And priests may eat matzah prepared from challah, the portion of dough that is given to priests, right? What we call challah today, it's a bread that we all kind of understand what challah is, but what the word challah actually means is that when you make your bread for your household to eat, you pull aside some of the dough. We still have that requirement to pull aside some of the dough when we make enough challah at one time. And that portion is set aside for the priests because we don't give these tithes to the priests today. That portion ends up getting burned. It's a small portion, but it's set aside for the priest. And so the priest may eat matzah prepared from challah. the portion of dough that is given to priests, or with teruma, as priests are permitted to eat these portions. However, one may not fulfill one's obligation to eat matzah with untithed produce, nor with matzah made from the first tithe, from which its teruma was not separated, nor with matzah made either from the second tithe, nor from consecrated grain that was not redeemed. This latter part of the Mishnah, which we're not going to be talking about tonight, just has to do with the idea that the dough or the wheat that you are going to use to make your matzah has to be properly yours, right? And we've seen already that produce, grain particularly, that is untithed, right? The portions weren't set aside for the priest, for the Levite, for the poor. If those tithes have not been removed from that grain, then it is untithed produce and is prohibited for all Jews to eat from it. So here what we're basically saying is that you can't make your matzah from grain that is prohibited to you. And with regard to one who prepared loaves of matzah that are brought with a thanks offering, or to the wafers brought by a Nazirite, these are offerings in the Holy Temple when it stands in Jerusalem, the sages drew the following distinction. If he prepared them for himself, then he does not fulfill his obligation to eat matzah with them. However, if he prepared them to sell them in the market to those who require these loaves or wafers, one does fulfill the obligation to eat matzah with them. That is our Mishnah. Now we're going to get into the Gemara that discusses that Mishnah. And tonight, for our class, we're going to focus on the kinds of grain that are permitted and the kinds of grain that are not permitted, and how the sages derive that in terms of what the matzah can be made out of, so that we have fulfilled our obligation to eat matzah on the first night of Passover, the first 2 nights outside the land of Israel. Now, what I thought I would do tonight, just a little bit different, I'm going to stick a little bit closer to the text here, which means that I'm going to be reading 2 things. I'm going to be reading the Gemara, right? So the way that the editors of the Gemara put it together, meaning Ravina and Rav Ashi, operating around the year 500 in the Babylonian Jewish community. And they sort of strung together the teachings of their fellow sages over the previous 300 years, who were commenting on the sages whose words were in the Mishnah for the previous 300 years before that. Okay? But also is going to be these words are going to be elucidated. So words in between the words that were added by Rav Steinsaltz. So Rav Adin Steinsaltz, who we lost last year, a terrific loss, tragic loss to the Jewish people and the whole world. So it's as if Rav Steinsaltz is teaching our class tonight. That's basically what I'm saying to you, though I will probably add a few of my own words as well. So the Gemara asks, from where are these matters that matzah cannot be prepared from? All right, so the first paragraph, let's just get that in there. The Gemara identifies the species mentioned in the Mishnah. One of the sages taught in the Tosefta, well, spelt is a type of wheat, oats and rye are a type of barley, and the Gemara translates the lesser-known species into the vernacular Aramaic, right? So even they were having trouble understanding what this, rye and oats and spelt, what they really were. And so they translated into Aramaic that spelt is gulba, and rye is dishra, and oats are shvele ta'ala. The Gemara infers these species of grain, yes, they may be used for matzah. However, rice and millet, which are translated from orez and dochan, no, they may not be used. Now, interesting, where does rice come from? Rice is definitely from Asia. And at the time that the Torah was given, we believe there was no rice in the Holy Land. But 1,200 years later, at the time that the Second Temple is destroyed and the rabbis of the Mishnaic period are operating, and then over the next few hundred years of the Talmudic period, between the years 200 and 500, rice had made its way into the Middle East, into the Holy Land area. So they certainly were familiar with rice. And then the question, of course, came up, is rice a grain that we could make bread from, or we could make a flat bread and fulfill our obligation to eat unleavened bread at Passover? So the question comes up, and now they're answering it. The Gemara asks, the first question is, why? They're going to say no rice, right? We cannot fulfill our obligation to eat matzah, to eat unleavened bread made from rice or millet. So the question is why? So the Gemara asks, from where are these matters that matzah cannot be prepared from rice or millet derived? Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish said, and likewise a sage of the school of Rabbi Yishmael taught, and likewise a sage of the school of Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov taught, that the verse states, now Deuteronomy 16:3, you shall eat no leavened bread with it. This is the Pesach, the Paschal offering. 7 days you shall eat with it matzah, the bread of affliction. So that's the command that you must eat matzah with the Paschal offering. The Paschal offering, a kid from the goats or a lamb from the sheep, we no longer eat at Passover. That was only while the temple was standing. Then the Jews of Israel would make a pilgrimage up to Jerusalem, roast the lamb or the goat, eat it with a group of people, and they had to eat it that night. Nothing could be left over till the next day. So with the Paschal offering, we must eat matzah, and then 7 days you shall eat with it matzah, the bread of affliction. This verse indicates that only with substances with which one can, only substances which will come to a state of leavening, a person fulfills his obligation to eat matzah with them, provided he prevents them from becoming leavened. This excludes these foods, i.e. rice, millet, and similar grains, which, even if flour is prepared from them and water is added to their flour, do not come to a state of leavening, but rather to a state of decay. Now, it's worth noting here that when we talk about leavened bread and what is excluded during Passover, okay, it's obvious that bread that comes in a bag, it's puffy bread, we cut it into slices and make sandwiches with it, that kind of bread is prohibited at Passover. But if you observe Passover, you know there's all kinds of other foods that aren't bread. They just seem to be leavened products that we cannot eat at Passover. Why? Why is it, if the idea is that we can't eat leavened bread, why, for example, do we need a special kind of Coca-Cola at Passover? Because it's not made with corn syrup, rather it's made with sugar, real cane sugar. So why is corn prohibited at Passover? And the bottom line is, whether or not you take your grain, let's say wheat, and mix it with water and yeast and whatever other elements you put into bread to normally make puffy bread, our tradition holds that these 5 grains, wheat, barley, spelt, oats, and rye, if you mix them with water and you make a dough, just the grain, right, the powdered grain and water, and let that sit for a while, that grain will ferment and it will rise somewhat. Now, that's still going to be a pretty flat bread. But if you let that alone, with maybe a little bit of warmth and just the flour and water for long enough, it will have some kind of rising, and that is what's prohibited. And that's why matzah, right, which is very simple, flat bread, of course it doesn't have yeast, but it also needs to be, put together, made and baked in 18 minutes. Like there's this strict time limit on how long it takes to make matzah so that it doesn't have time to rise at all. Forget, even without yeast, those grains will rise a little. So what the sages are telling us here is the only kinds of grains that can be used in matzah are grains that if you mix them with water will rise on their own, and then we don't let them rise. And so that's what qualifies them as matzah during Passover. So the question is, if a grain is mixed with water, does it rise in the form of bread? If so, then it's going to qualify to be matzah. So rice and millet, do they rise in this way? Obviously, rice expands when you put it in water, but is that rising? If you grind it and make a kind of a powder out of it, mix it with water, is the kind of, is it going to ferment in that same way? And the sages experimented with it, and they're going to have actually a split opinion on this. So the Gemara notes, The Mishnah, which says we may not use rice and millet for matzah, is not in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri, who said rice is a full-fledged type of grain and one is liable to receive karet for eating it in its leavened state like other types of grain. Kares is a penalty, excision, death at the hands of the heavenly court, and that's the Torah-mandated penalty for a Jew that eats chametz, leavened products, leavened bread or leavened products during Passover. So Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri says if you eat some kind of a bread made out of rice during Passover, you are subject to the penalty of kares, and therefore, if you eat it in its unleavened state, it would satisfy the requirement to eat matzah. As it was taught in a baraisa, Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri prohibits eating cooked rice and millet on Passover due to the fact that they are close to being leavened. So Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri, maybe it wasn't a question of certainty for him, but for him it's like, well, wait a minute, the rice, you cook it, it expands. It's a grain. It looks like a grain when it's growing. It grows when you cook it. That's close enough to being a leavened product. So maybe we should prohibit eating it during Passover. So a dilemma was raised before the scholars who were studying this issue. What is the meaning of the expression that it is close to becoming leavened, according to Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri? Does that mean that it will be leavened even quicker than wheat or barley? Did Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri mean actually that these grains, when you cook them with water, not only do they leaven, but they leaven even faster than wheat and barley? Or does it perhaps mean that it is only close to becoming leavened, i.e. it resembles leavened bread, but it is not full-fledged leavened bread? In other words, perhaps Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri maintains that these grains cannot, in fact, become full-fledged leavened bread, and one is not punished with kares for eating them on Passover. However, he rules that one should nevertheless avoid eating them due to their similarity to leavened bread. So the Gemara responds. The issue is raised why the Mishnah prohibits rice and millet to be used to make bread for Passover. Rabbi Yochanan prohibits them to be used as matzah because they're not leavened bread products. They're not leavened products. Therefore, according to the Mishnah, we can eat them during Passover because they're not related to grains that become leavened. And therefore, according to the Mishnah, we can eat rice and millet during Passover. Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri prohibits us to eat rice and millet during Passover because they're a grain product. So then it would seem that he would permit them to be used for matzah, right? So it's an interesting connection. What is prohibited to use as matzah is permissible to eat at Passover, and what is permitted to use as matzah is if it has a chance to leaven and it's not in the form of matzah, is prohibited during Passover. The Gemara responds, come in here a resolution to this question. As it was taught in a baraita, that Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri said, rice is a full-fledged type of grain. Therefore, one is liable to receive kares for eating it in its leavened state, and a person can fulfill his obligation to eat matzah with it on Passover. So the other teaching of Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri was a little unclear. This one is solidly clear. According to Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri, rice is a full-fledged type of grain. You can make matzah out of it, and you cannot cook it and eat it during Passover. And so too, Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri would say, one who has prepared bread from keramit, which is a type of wild wheat, is obligated to separate challah, just as he must separate challah from dough prepared from other types of grain. The Gemara asked, what is keramit? Abaye said that this is shitzanita. Since this name was not widely known either, the Gemara asks, what is shitzanita? And Rav Papa said, this is the wild grain that is found between papyrus reeds. So this was a kind of quick little digression about Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri, who was saying that a certain grain, which the Koran Talmud identifies as water manna grass, is a grain, and if one makes bread out of it, he must separate challah for the priest, and presumably he can make matzah out of it. Okay. And that was just additional, that was simply the second part of the Baraisa in which Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri said, rice is a full-fledged type of grain. We cannot eat it during Passover in its cooked state, but we can make matzah out of it. Rabba Bar Bar Chana said that Reish Lakish said, with regard to dough that was kneaded with wine, oil, or honey, one is not liable to receive cart. So just by the way, where we left that discussion for a moment about eating rice and millet on Passover is that the sages permit eating rice during Passover, but not making matzah out of it. And Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri prohibits us to eat rice during Passover, during the whole 7-day holiday, but permits us to make matzah out of some kind of rice grain dough. So we leave that aside for a moment. Rabba Bar Chana said that Reish Lakish said, with regard to dough that was kneaded with wine, oil, or honey, one is not liable to receive kares for eating it in its leavened state, since these liquids will not cause the dough to be leavened. So now they're saying something like, what? What did you say? Right? So if you make your dough, now let's just say wheat, and you make your bread dough, and instead of using water, you use a different liquid than water. You use oil, or you use wine, or you use honey. That bread may rise, but it is not bread. It does not meet the definition of bread, and therefore it is not called leavened bread, and that would be permitted at Passover, just according to this particular teaching, but it would not be permitted to satisfy one's obligation of eating unleavened bread, matzah, on the first nights of Passover. Rav Papa and Rav Huna, the son of Rav Yehoshua, were sitting before Rav Idi bar Avin. This is great. So these two sages, Rav Papa and Rav Huna, the son of Rav Yehoshua, were sitting before their teacher, Rav Idi bar Avin, and Rav Idi bar Avin was sitting and dozing as his students conversed. Right, so the teacher fell asleep, and the students kept talking about their studies. Right, they were really into learning Torah. When the teacher fell asleep, they kept learning Torah. Okay, so where am I? Then it was dozing as the students conversed. So Rav Huna, the son of Rav Yehoshua, said to Rav Papa, "What is the reason of Reish Lakish, who maintains that one is not liable to receive kares for this type of leavening?" Meaning that this rich dough, this rich bread made with either wine, honey, or oil, if you eat that during Passover, you have not transgressed the Torah prohibition on eating leavened bread during the festival. And so you are not liable to death at the hands of the heavenly court. Rav Papa said to him, the verse states, "You shall eat no leavened bread with it. 7 days you shall eat it. You shall eat with it matzah." Deuteronomy 16:3. Now, in light of the juxtaposition of leavened bread and matzah, right? Leavened bread and matzah are both in this verse. So here's the basic principle about how we satisfy our obligation to eat matzah. So in light of the juxtaposition of leavened bread and matzah in this verse, Reish Lakish compares these two types of bread. So with regard to those substances through which a person fulfills his obligation to eat matzah, one is liable to receive kares for eating them in their leavened state. And with regard to this dough, which was kneaded with wine, oil, or honey, since a person does not fulfill his obligation to eat matzah with it, as it is called rich, i.e. enhanced matzah, one is not liable to receive karet for eating it in its leavened state on Passover. Matzah is called the bread of affliction, or the poor man's bread, a description that does not apply to dough prepared with wine, oil, or honey. So we really have two reasons there why this rich matzah, this rich bread made with instead of water made with wine, oil, or honey, it doesn't qualify as matzah because matzah is understood to be the bread of affliction, poor man's bread. We ate it in a hurry. We didn't have time to let it rise. Enhanced or the rich man's bread made with these more expensive liquids would not qualify as matzah. But the more fundamental principle is anything that is permitted to use as matzah in its unleavened state is going to be prohibited to eat in any state where it could possibly become leavened during Passover. And conversely, anything which is permitted to eat, in it, whether it would leavened or not, during Passover is not going to qualify to be matzah. Okay? Anything permitted to eat in its leavened state, that it has the possibility of rising, is not going to qualify to. Like, you can't make, for example, during Passover, we often do things with potato starch, right? We make cakes out of potato starch because we can't use wheat. So that's something that's permitted to eat all during Passover, and we would be prohibited to make matzah from it. Okay. Rav Huna, the son, and now I'm almost done at the end of the part that we're going to read together here. So if you've got questions or comments, make sure you get them into the comments now. Rav Huna, the son of Rav Yehoshua, raised an objection to Rav Papa. We learn with regard to one who took a baked item, dissolved it in water, and swallowed this mixture on Passover. If the baked item is leavened bread, he is punished with kares. And if it is matzah, a person does not fulfill his obligation to eat matzah on Passover with this food. So if you take leavened bread, okay, that's prohibited no matter what during Passover. If you put that in a glass of water, obviously it's still going to be prohibited. If you take matzah, which is permitted, right, to eat during Passover and to use to fulfill your obligation, but you put it in a glass of water, now it's not going to fulfill your obligation to eat matzah. Why? Perhaps because when you put even matzah in water and it soaks for too long, or because the water sort of destroys its form and it's not matzah. Unclear here. What is the reason? And if it is matzah, a person does not fulfill his obligation to eat matzah on Passover with this food. The reason one does not fulfill the obligation to eat matzah is because swallowing in this manner, soaking matzah in water and then taking this mixture of matzah and water and sort of drinking it, is not considered an act of eating, right? Obviously, you're ingesting it, but eating, when it's talking about fulfilling an obligation in the Torah, is going to have a more specific definition. It needs to be food and not liquid, and this mixture of matzah dissolved in water is too much like a liquid. But here we have a case where a person does not fulfill his obligation to eat matzah with this dissolved food, and nevertheless he is liable to receive karet for eating it in its leavened state. And this ruling seems to conflict with Rav Papa's general principle. At this point, Rav Edi Bar Avin woke up. The teacher woke up due to their discussion, and he said to them, "Children, this is the reasoning of Reish Lakish. One is not liable to receive kares for eating dough kneaded with oil or honey, because oil and honey are considered fruit juices, and fruit juice does not cause dough to be leavened. Therefore, dough prepared with these liquids is not considered full-fledged leavened bread." And indeed, the halacha, rich matzah, dough kneaded with any liquid other than water, is not considered leavened bread, and it may be eaten on Passover. However, one cannot fulfill his obligation to eat matzah by consuming this so-called rich matzah. And to return for a moment to this question of rice and millet, we saw that the Mishnah said rice and millet are not full-fledged grains like wheat and barley, rye, spelt, and oats. Therefore, you cannot make matzah out of it, but you can eat it during Passover. And Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri, the minority opinion, said rice is a full-fledged grain, and so is millet, and you can make matzah out of it. And if you cook it during Passover, you're not allowed to eat it. Rabbi Yochanan Nuri's was the minority opinion. The law is that rice and millet, you can't make matzah out of them. You can't eat rice cakes and say you fulfilled your obligation to eat matzah on the first couple nights of Passover. However, if you grew up as a Jew, descended from Ashkenazi family, meaning Northern European Jews, then you'll probably be asking, Sal, what are you talking about? We're not allowed to eat rice on Passover. My family doesn't eat rice on Passover, nor do we eat corn, nor do we eat lentils, nor do we eat other kinds of legumes. And these are all called kitniot. That is a category of foods, basically legumes, but rice and corn are included in this group. And the question is, why? Now, interestingly, Sephardic Jews, Southern European Jews, do eat, it's different traditions. Some just eat kitniot, no problem. Some will eat kitniot during Passover, but won't do certain things with it. So how did the law get to be that way? Let's read the halacha. Rice, millet, and other grains similar to the 5 types are all considered kitniot, legumes, with which one may not fulfill the obligation to eat matzah. This ruling is in accordance with the majority opinion of the rabbis, contrary to Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri. Since we accept the Gemara's assertion that these other species do not become leavened, it is permitted to cook them during Passover. However, some authorities prohibit doing so out of concern that one might mistakenly mingle one of the forbidden 5 types of grain, wheat, barley, rye, spelt, and oats, with these grains, the kitniot, which are permitted. Specifically, how did this come to be? In Northern Europe, over time, the rabbis ruled it's prohibited. Why? Because how did you purchase these grains? The grain sellers would bring bags of grain to the market. They would open the bags. People would come along with their own containers, and they would take the big scoop and shovel out the grain into the people's containers, and they would take the grain home and make their bread, etc. with it. Come Passover, these people did not want to buy wheat, spelt, wheat, barley, rice, rye, spelt, or oats. They were in the market for different grains, like rice and millet and corn and other legumes. But the problem was that the sellers who would transport these grains, in many communities, there was no sort of Jewish train of transmission from where the grains were grown all the way, bringing it to market and traveling along the roads of, medieval and ancient Europe. And so there were non-Jews along the chain, or at least non-religious Jews, and they would use the same burlap bags to transport the grain that they'd used to transport wheat during the year were now being used to transport these other grains. They didn't care because the rest of their customers didn't care. Why should they care? So what was very likely to happen is that the grains that were permitted on Passover would have a certain amount of the grains that were prohibited on Passover mixed in with them. And so the rabbis decreed potatoes, because potatoes don't get transported in the same bags that grain gets transported in. But anything that's a grain ended up being prohibited because of this problem. Now, you might ask, well, why in modern times, when there's all kinds of government regulations that ensure that the wheat on its path from the wheat fields of the farmer in Kansas to your supermarket, in Los Angeles, it doesn't get mixed with corn or rice, and the rice doesn't get mixed with wheat, etc. All these products are kept very much separated. So the concern that existed 1,000 years ago no longer exists. And so why not permit people to eat the kitniot now? And the answer is that over time, that ruling acquired such a strong force of custom that it remains in force. And basically, we don't eat those grains during Passover because our ancestors didn't, for the last 1,000 years. Now, there are some permissive rulings on this subject in different movements of Judaism who say, well, for this reason, the original reason is no longer there. But basically, in Ashkenazic Orthodox communities and Haredi Orthodox communities, that don't eat kitniot, they keep not eating kitniot. But there's often a joke that, when an Ashkenazic woman marries a Sephardic man, then she goes into his house, so to speak, and now she's permitted, and so that's a cause for celebration because she can eat corns and beans and legumes and lentils and whatnot during Passover. But that's how we historically came to this situation that according to the halacha, rice and millet are permitted because you can't make matzah out of them. Therefore, you can eat them in their cooked form during Passover. But they remain prohibited because of this historical antecedent that there used to be a problem, a fear that they would be mixed with other grains. All right, that's what I've got for us this evening. Let us see comments or questions. Lynn, and I'm sorry. And then what comes next on this daf? Just to finish, I'm not going to teach it, but just to summarize what's there. The rest of the page focuses on tithing. And the basic concept is that matzah must come from properly tithed produce, or at least produce where there is the possibility that a person can legally eat it. So, for example, can you eat matzah made from grain that was part of the poor man's tithe? Yes, you shouldn't. If you're not a poor person, you shouldn't eat it from that tithe. But it's at least theoretically possible that you could at any moment declare all your property. Or at any moment, a person could declare his property ownerless. He could just give everything away, and then he would be poor. And then he would qualify to eat from the poor man's tithe. He doesn't need to do that, but at least since it's possible, so then a person can fulfill his obligation from matzah made from wheat that came from the poor man's tithe. But untithed produce, which was not tithed at all, that is absolutely prohibited for Jews to eat from, and so he could not eat matzah that was made from untithed produce. And that kind of discussion occupies the rest of our page. All right, Lynn, the Gemara does not appear to turn to the principle of avoiding the appearance of sin when discussing avoiding rice millet because the spoilage just looks like leavening. Is that a more modern term? Right, so she's saying, if you make, so they're talking about, here it's worded as decay, the form of leavening, but to a state of decay. That when you mix rice grain with water, it doesn't rise, but something happens, and it's really just the process of that rice decaying, that rice grain decaying as it mixes with water. So Lynn says, well, maybe the problem is that this is close enough, and this is maybe what Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri was saying, right? That this process of decay of rice grain looks at least similar to leaven, and therefore we need to avoid it because of the appearance of impropriety. I mean, it's a good argument. They didn't make it, but it could have been made. Okay, also Lynn says this description of the matzah smoothie is amusing. Would be done for those with no teeth, perhaps. Perhaps, but as we see, one does not fulfill his obligation if you put a whole bunch of matzah in water. By the way, this sounds really weird, but I got to tell you, my grandmother and my mom, who are Hungarian, and surely they didn't invent this custom that came from their families since who knows how far back. They during Passover would put matzah in their coffee. They love that. I remember my mom and grandmother doing that, or in their tea. Not coffee, tea. They were more tea drinkers. I think maybe my mom did it with coffee. My grandmother did it with tea. But isn't that interesting? Like they, in their morning, during Passover, their morning tea, a little bit of milk, a little bit of honey, and a little bit of matzah. They weren't trying to fulfill their obligation. It was just something that they considered a treat that they would have during Passover. Chaim Burke asks, it is a custom not to have matzah come into contact with water. It's called gebrokus. Exactly, gebroks. So that's why, but that's not for everybody, right? That's not for everybody. That's kind of a level of stringency, even within the Ashkenazi community, that's a little bit higher, where they're just not even going to allow matzah to come into contact with water. Interesting. What's more Passover than matzo ball soup? That's Passover, right? Matzo ball soup. I did not grow up Orthodox, and that was definitely part of our Passover tradition. And there's definitely matzo ball soup even in the Orthodox world, but not throughout the Orthodox world. There are definitely some communities, and I believe Chabad is one of them, that will not eat matzo ball soup. And the reason is that the matzo ball is made out of matzah meal, and then it's deposited in soup where it sits for more than 18 minutes for sure. And that means that there's a chance that even though there's no yeast present, that there's going to be a leavening going on within the matzah ball, and so they don't eat it. That is not a universal custom even in the Orthodox world, but it is for some people. Stephen Giger says diversion of attention when transporting the grains. Right, so you're talking about what we learned yesterday, this idea that but that was with respect to consecrated foods, right? So for teruma or for grains or meats that were set aside to be an offering, either to give to the priest or to put up on the altar, they needed to be in a guarded state. And the issue was that if they were left unguarded in a situation where they were vulnerable, where they might have come into contact with tuma, with sources of ritual impurity, that they might have become tameh. That's why they need to be in a secure state, not with an armed guard, but in a secure state where that won't happen. And if they were left unsecured, we had that argument yesterday. Are they inherently disqualified because they were unguarded, and that's the disqualification? Or is it that they're disqualified because of the possibility that they became tameh? That was yesterday's discussion. If we apply that principle of diversion of attention to those, right, we don't have a Jewish chain of transmission of the grains that might have become mixed, right, with other kinds of grains, and that's why they ended up outlawing kitniot during Passover. It's a good point, Stephen, because the principle is so similar, right? They can't ensure that those grains didn't get mixed. They wouldn't call that diversion of attention, but it's the same idea. Sharon says, my dad also put matzah in his coffee, but he was from Poland. So maybe it's just an Eastern European thing. Sharon, thank you for telling me that. You're the first person I've met who had the same thing in their family. Not that I mentioned this to so many people, but that's the first time I've heard of other people doing it. So awesome. And finally, Yehudit Sobel, I always look forward to spending time with my grandmother for our morning matzah with tea or coffee. So Yehudit, you had it too. I guess it was, okay, so it was a common thing. I just didn't know. I only, in my life, saw my mom and grandma doing it. All right, that's what I've got for us this evening. Again, shkoyach, yasher koach to you. May you be strengthened. You started your week off with some beautiful Torah learning. May you be strengthened to start all your weeks until 120 years of age with a little bit of Torah learning. All the best, a good vach, and Shavua Tov. May you have a great